Maddie, or better known as the American Gopnik. Mate, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Of course, it seemed like an interesting opportunity, so why not?
Yeah, no, I hope it's interesting enough. Look, can you just start? I guess who are you? What was your background before going to Ukraine to serve?
Well, I had sort of two jobs or interests that both worked out to be related to this. In my normal day-to-day life, I worked in private security, doing things like close protection work, um, some workplace violence stuff, as well as a few federal government contracts. And I was actually supposed to take a, force protection contract for the NATO KFOR base in Kosovo before I came here, and I just came here instead. And then my other thing that I did, which is what I'm more well known for, is I had sort of a side project as a open source intelligence journalist focusing on conflict. So those two sort of professions ended up leading me to here.
Legends, if you're like me, you work more hours than ever inside, and work seems to be more stressful than ever. And I know after work, I can find it very hard to relax, not only after work, but sometimes during work in my office, as my living space, my home has now become my office, as a lot of us have moved work home. Well, with today's video sponsor, Galaxy Lamps, the Galaxy projector can help you immerse yourself in the beauty of a starry night right from the comfort of your own home. Now, the Galaxy projector boasts a stunning array of vivid colors, dynamic lighting effects that will absolutely transport you into another dimension. I find it really helps me relax. Now, whether you're looking to create a relaxing atmosphere, spark creativity, or enhance your next social gathering, the Galaxy projector is the perfect addition to any space. You can choose from a variety of customizable settings to match your mood, from gentle blues for tranquility to vibrant purples for inspiration. And it's fully customizable on their intuitive app that works with Google Assistant and Amazon Alexa. And best of all, it's very, very energy efficient as well. For those that appreciate good technology, who want to relax, wow your friends, or a great gift, the Galaxy projector is a modern gadget with timeless appeal. Get your Galaxy projector by clicking the link below while the Christmas sale is on, and use my discount code WILLYOAM for an extra 15% off. The link will be in the top comment and the description as well. Thank you, Galaxy Lamps, for sponsoring this video. Yeah, and this is something that's very interesting about your story that we'll jump into, is your journalism side and then your combatant side. Can you sort of talk about where that then had that shift?
Well, for me, what caused that shift for me was my time spent covering the start of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. Because one thing you keep running into, especially early on, is that when you go through this, there's so many people that have been mobilized and are actively fighting that had no past experience as soldiers. They had no previous weapon training. They had no plans or experience or any other reason that they would be fighting aside from the fact that they had no other choice. And after a few weeks for me, it was very difficult to spend 10, 12 hours a day just watching this sort of thing while sitting at home and thinking, well, I have like a decent amount of relevant training. I'm in good shape. There's no reason why I could not do this and why I'm not more prepared than a lot of people that are already having to fight. And so eventually I just said, fuck it, I'm gonna go. So broke the lease on my apartment, sold or gave away most of my stuff, packed up all my gear into a couple of bags, and got a one-way plane ticket to Poland.
Yeah. And had you spent time in Ukraine previously?
Nope. First time in Ukraine was late March
Yes.
of 2022.
And how was that sort of first impression? Because late March 22, if I think back, was Kiev just liberated on the outskirts or just pushing back the Russians then? I'm trying to get, it's all a blur about that time
Yeah.
for me.
So when I arrived, the battle for Kiev was actively going on, and the curfew time started at like something like 9 p.m.
Yeah.
And so I got to the train station after curfew, and I was basically just stuck in the train station all night. Um, I just remember just standing on one of the platforms outside and smoking a cigarette, and I could hear grads and smirches just shooting cluster munitions in the outskirts of the city. You could actually You could hear the artillery duel from the Kiev Central train station.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a wild time around then in the country, man. And it's hard when you're there, post that you're like, how could that actually happen? It seems so surreal.
Yeah. No, it was Ukraine is drastically calmed down and society is much more business as usual at this stage. But for the first like 4 or 5 months, things were much more chaotic and very different. Especially like during the sort of battle for Kiev time when the entire country had shut down. It was honestly pretty grim. There was like one day, a few days after I got here, I went to a grocery store just to get some food. And I remember just going over by the vegetables and seeing that literally all of the onions were rotting. And at that moment, I had this thought where I was like, this is not good.
Yeah. Did you have a feel of like, what have I fucking stepped into here?
Yeah, I definitely had a moment of maybe I should have planned this a little bit better because when I originally came, my plan was just to go straight here, join the International Legion, let's go. Then while I was basically in transit from the United States, the base at Yavoriv got blown up. And so when I got to Poland, I my thought process was, wait a second, the Legion seems to like have at least temporarily collapsed. I need to start looking for alternatives. And so that delayed me for a couple of weeks. And then because of just how there were so many issues with integrating foreign volunteers into units, and basically this was when new foreigner groups were being formed and then collapsing on themselves into drama like overnight, like on a daily basis. By the time I got to Kiev, like my initial plan for where I was going fell apart, and it actually took me like 3.5, 4 weeks before I even like got into an actual unit of any kind.
That time in the war, the foreign groups were all over the place. I remember talking to some guys, and
Yeah,
it's just absolute mess in there at that time because it was a desperate time. No one knew if there was going to be a Ukraine in the next day, 2 days, week. Like in that beginnings of the war, it was so crazy because at the end of the day, we still thought Russia was the Russia we thought it was previous to that invasion, if that made sense. And military guys, you have that propaganda belief, I guess, for an amount of time because the Western militaries thrived off that propaganda for decades of like, you guys are training to fight a near peer enemy at the same as you. And it was just crazy. It was a real fight for survival right in the city centers as well.
yeah. I think the trap that a lot of people fall into when looking at the Russian or Chinese militaries is they look at the way the United States military or other NATO militaries deal with publicity regarding their technology and capabilities. Like when the United States has a piece of technology, be that the Patriot SAM system or the M1A2 SET V3 Abrams or something like that, the capabilities generally moderately to heavily exceed what is publicly disclosed. So when the United States military says that this piece of technology can do X, it can generally do more than that. And X was the absolute minimum that the contract allowed. And the contractor made sure to well exceed those standards so they wouldn't get in trouble. So when you look at America's capabilities, you know that it's better than whatever is stated. Russia and China do not do that. A lot of the times it's since their cultures tend to more focus on sort of face and showing the appearance of strength, they tend to overly inflate the public specifications of what their gear can do. And so the result is that when a lot of Western analysts and journalists just look at that information, they take it at face value and goes, well, I know that we do this where we understate our capabilities. And that's why like so much of our tech is classified and all that. They must do the same thing. So if this is what they claim they have, we don't know how much better it actually is. And that turned out to be bullshit. Like none of their stuff works as advertised to the point where RostDEC's market has been drying up pretty steadily over the last 2 or 3 years because a lot of people are very disappointed with the performance that their products actually are capable of.
Yeah, and that was a huge thing for Russia was the export of those weapon systems from tanks, weapons, planes, all of that as well. And there has been a lot of rumor, well, not only rumor, there's been a lot of talk about countries being like, well, we've seen how this has performed. we're not happy with it. We don't want it. And you see with the US or Australia, one of these countries, when we have a good bit of kit, the export market opens up of like, that's great. We want that. So yeah.
I mean, right now that's been especially evident with the Bradley, just because the Bradleys that are being used in Ukraine are like the first generation unupgraded ones that were available in the late 1980s or something like that. And they've incredibly overperformed, not just against other Russian IFVs like the BMP-3, but they've even killed a surprising number of Russia's main battle tanks. And so they BAE in the UK has actually restarted production of the Bradley.
Yeah.
Like, and that's a piece of late Cold War tech that is outperforming Russia's post Cold War equipment. It's really bad for RostDEC. And what I've been observing too over the last year or so is that Russia's killed its own export market, not just through having their stuff underperform, but also they've lost so much hardware that now they've been going to their customers like Brazil and India and actually asking them to return their gear, return the equipment they purchased so they can use it here. Like, there was actually an incident where a bunch of Indian T90s were basically in Russia for repair when the full-scale invasion started, and Russia just kept them. They never sent them back. I believe Armenia is currently waiting on a $400 million arms purchase from the Russian government they made in 2021 that still hasn't been delivered, and Russia is showing no indication of actually delivering it. So,
yeah, it's a big issue for, and especially, how important that military economy is for your own economy of, producing goods, exporting those goods. And, Russia being sanctioned by many places, that's just one other outlet that is limiting itself as it goes.
One interesting thing I've noticed is that France actually seems to have been eating a good chunk of Russia's market share alive, because they're willing to sell to a lot of people that, like the United States, the UK, and Germany aren't. And they've been making a ton of sales of the Rafale.
Oh, really?
Like, or Rafale. Yeah, no, they have a ton of contracts for like some Middle Eastern and Asian countries, no, or African countries that are like not Western aligned but not sanctioned either. And yeah, it's just Russia absolutely screwed themselves, at least when it comes to their arms export business.
Money's going to go where money goes. But I guess on the flip side of that too, there are pieces of equipment that have performed well that I guess people will look into. So like as far as my reading, it's like the Kar-52 helicopter has actually performed fairly well. There are countries looking at that as an option as well.
Well, I mean, the Alligator has done pretty well. The only problem is they're running out of them. Like something like 60% are either grounded for maintenance issues or have been destroyed. And the ones that are grounded for maintenance issues, they are not actually capable of fixing them. So while it's a decent helicopter from all accounts, it seems like they can't actually build more of them anymore because they were dependent on imports for, I suspect, things like avionics and the like. So
yeah,
I mean, it might have been a decent helicopter, but what does that matter if they can't build them anymore?
true. I don't. From the Australian Army, we can't speak about bloody helicopters not being grounded the entire time. But I've never been aboard. I spent 6.5 years in the Australian Army, and I saw a helicopter about once where our fleet is just permanently grounded. But
Didn't you guys buy into the Eurocopter or something?
bro, don't bring it up. We bought the Eurocopter, the Tigers, and then like the ARH Tiger, and then we bought the MRH 90. The MRH 90 people should have been charged with bloody murder, minimum manslaughter over that. It has actively, to be honest, I think we got away lucky with how, like, yes, it's killed many people, but it has killed less than I think the quality of the helicopter should have. And the ARH, that when we had the Apache as an option, like we could have Apache, it fits with all our other systems. Like Australia is a completely Americanized army. We've got F-18s, F-35s, all this other kit, everything's Harris, whatever, and we're going to buy this ARH that has nothing, like shit. And now we're going back to Blackhawks, back to Apaches, and it's like, well, not back to Apache, but getting Apaches. Like, what the fuck? Same with the AUG, like the Steyr we shoot. It's Austrian built. It's the reason it's got a big trigger guard is for snow gloves, and it's like, we're Australians. Like, How often are we going to ever be in the snow? But
No, that's fair. I know the MRH-90 has actually been so bad that the Norwegian military recently basically said they are returning literally every single one they have. They're just they're sending them back and just getting their money back,
right,
mainly because they couldn't even get enough like repair parts to maintain them. They I think were able to run them for half of the intended flight hours for the program just because the manufacturer couldn't supply enough parts for maintenance.
that
Like,
doesn't surprise me at all. With yeah, the military, but all militaries do this. There's bits of fantastic equipment and bits of just shit, and you're like, how did you not? How did you guys not come together with this? Like, I'm a dumb private soldier, and I could have told you that's not a good option. Like, like, but it's probably people getting their pockets lined somewhere up the top.
I always assume that there's like some sort of like really like grim, cynical spreadsheet somewhere where they're like, is the human cost or the pain in the ass level of the problems with this system more expensive than replacing it with something better? And if the answer is no, the solution is, well, tough shit. Like, I don't know. Did you ever get trained on the Stinger uh
No, I've never,
manpad?
no, I've never been trained on it, but yeah,
So the Stinger is, I think it's like a mid to late 70s design. It has got to be one of the most user unfriendly pieces of kit
yeah,
I have ever touched. Um, it has such features as the battery that actually like powers the command launch unit and fires off the missile. Once you start priming it, like trying to lock onto an aircraft, you get 40 to 50 seconds, not 50 seconds or 40 seconds exactly. No, 40 to 50. So, like, you have a 10-second window where it could just die on you, where you
yeah.
can actually use it. If you don't launch it after you start priming it within that window, you have to put another battery in, which is why every missile comes with 3 batteries. If you do successfully launch it, you then immediately need to unscrew the battery and drop it on the ground because the battery heats up to about 400 degrees Celsius. And if you do not immediately strip it out of the command launch unit, you will just melt it.
Right.
Oh, and also there's glass over the sensor on the missile in the tube. And so when you fire it, it has a not pretty good chance actually of just launching a bunch of broken glass shards into your face. And in the name of protecting you, there is a piece of plexiglass about the size of a quarter that sits over your non-dominant eye that isn't looking through the sight.
It's typical. It's typical military. Yeah, people think military equipment is like the be all end all, and you see like hikers and these uh bloody role players and stuff are like military grade. You're like anyone who's in the military is like, no, 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 that sucks. Like that, whatever that sucks because you think like what we're talking about with American military equipment that it's classified level and then it's a step of 10-20% better again.
Yeah.
Imagine how much better the non lowest bidder was. That like at the end of the day, we've got the lowest bidder that filled the contract and it's still better. We all know that there's a better system somewhere, but we just can't afford it. Well, they didn't want to afford it.
Yeah, and I mean the issue with the Stinger though is on one hand, I hate it. I do not want to ever have to fire it, but I can understand why it has not been substantially improved. And that's because as it is, the Stinger is a decent manpad. It works pretty well. And also, how much of excuse me, how much of American military doctrine actually involves the use of manpads?
Yeah.
Pretty much none. Like the manpad, it's something that's like distributed to allies and occasionally used by like certain special operations forces. It's something that never really gets used. So there's no need to throw more money at it, especially when it still works. So
No, I feel you. There's plenty of things that it's good enough. It's good enough. So after that, after you got to Kiev and you spent that, 3.5 weeks, whatever it was, finding a unit where to go. How did that go from there?
oh, it was an absolute disaster. Um
Right.
So I ended up just like a separate company of what was supposed to be a Marine Special Operations unit consisting of basically entirely foreigners with just some Ukrainian command staff. The unit was supposed to have like private funding and stuff like that, and we were all supposed to get contracts. Um, happened. We didn't get contracts. We filled out paperwork to start the process for contracts. They never arrived. After a few weeks there, like no one was getting paid, and generally a unit cohesion was quite low. No one there liked each other. There was one team, British, that I was not on, and then there was the team that I was on was a mix of like Americans with some Canadians and Latin Americans. And then we also did not get along at all well with the British team. And then the rest of the unit was a bunch of Georgians who didn't even really get along with each other. So there was a few times where there was almost some actual physical conflicts. We were then told after like people started getting really antsy that there was high level intelligence suggested that Russia was about to launch a second attack on Kiev from Belarus with 54 attack helicopters and 800 VDV. And this was also happening anywhere in the next 48 to 72 hours. So we were all basically told, yeah, you're going to need to go and set up defensive positions outside of Kiev to prepare for this assault. This led to me getting the worst op order I've ever received in my life. It wasn't bad in the sense of like my team leader did a bad job delivering. It was bad in the sense of if this is real, we're all going to die. It was something like a mission, right? Just go out. Or situation was we're getting attacked by all these people in the next 3 days, and this is a company-sized element at best, more like a platoon and a half. Like mission, slow them down as much as possible before someone else can come.
Yes.
Execution. We're going to go out into this swamp outside of Kiev and dig a primary defensive line, a secondary defensive line, and build a patrol base. Yeah, as I said, in a swamp. We're supposed to dig trenches in a swamp.
Yep, that'll help.
Yeah, our supporting element was a territorial defense unit consisting of 26 rifles. When my team leader asked them, like, do you mean 26 people? There's like, no, 26 rifles. So it could have been like two guys in a truck with just a bunch of rifles in the back.
Yeah. Could have been fucking
Then,
awesome, right?
yeah, just like no fire support, no, like literally nothing for command and signal. It was like, we're gonna have radios. Okay, what kind of radios? How many radios? There will be radios. But like, how are we planning this? Worry about your own squad. Then also both the like company commander and his deputy were going to be at the same command post anywhere from 500 meters to 20 kilometers away from the line. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So all this, it's just shit like that over and over. Like anytime anyone had a question, it was, they said, worry about your own squad or don't worry about it. So we were all getting ready for that. And then on the morning we were supposed to push out, my entire team quit. And the reason for that was that there was one guy on the team who had actually, I joined after Irpin and Bucha, but that team was actually in Irpin and Bucha. And there was one guy that stepped on a nail and got a really bad foot infection. And they were basically like denying him medical care, claiming that he must have injured his foot before he went out on mission because there's no way it could get that infected that fast.
Right.
Oh, it can absolutely get, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're just fucking him around. And at the time, people that had been like in a military unit, if they didn't get papers that said basically they'd been released from the military, there was an issue where they basically just have all of their tactical gear stolen at the border. So
Really?
yeah, and my team leader's been trying to get this guy basically his release letter for the last like 2 or 3 weeks by the time this rolls around, and they still haven't given it to him. And so before we were supposed to go out, he was like, look, before we go out, I need you to get him his papers because if your intelligence is accurate, none of us are coming back from this. He's not going out on mission. He barely even speaks English. So if like the people that do go out die, there's not going to be anyone that can help him with this.
Yeah.
And they basically said, we'll deal with it later. So we all ended up walking. And it didn't matter because the mission was most likely made up just to keep people there for an extra few weeks. There was no large scale air assault on Kiev after that point. The people that were told 48 to 72 hours in the swamps ended up spending 2.5 weeks there. Um, and then the Georgians that didn't go on mission ended up having a stabbing related incident on base in the kitchen a few days later. So,
Shit. Well, around that time, we were hearing a lot about that these foreign elements were getting sent on like literal suicide missions with a couple of magazines and a few radios. And what do you make of that? Because I talk to people who go, that's complete bullshit. I talk to guys who go, look, it wasn't far off that at that point, but it was a desperate time.
I think it comes down mostly to disorganization and the very, very bureaucratic nature of essentially the way equipment is issued, at least at first. Because basically, the standard policy when you go and check out your weapon is your weapon comes with 4 magazines. And the only magazines they have in the armory are the magazines that are attached to the weapons, right? Or at least this is the way it was for a long time. So the idea being like you get your weapon in 4 magazines because that's what normally issued. Well, obviously you need more than 4 magazines. Well, we can't issue you more than four magazines because we need the magazines for everyone else that's getting issued weapons. So that's how you get instances where people are only going out with 4 magazines because that's all they can issue them. It's not nearly as much of a problem now, especially with a lot more units using NATO standard rifles because you can just buy PMags. Uh, and also I never had subsequently like on my actual combat deployments, I never went out like without enough magazines. I was never like issued just 4 magazines and told that's it. For my first deployment, for example, I was only issued 4 magazines with my rifle, but aside from that, there were just like buckets of magazines elsewhere that you could just pull from. It there was so much ammo that like we had a range at the fob, and you could just go out and shoot like 200 rounds a day if you wanted to. It wasn't an issue.
Yeah, right. Well, it's good that that's not an issue there because yeah, I'd heard some bloody horror stories about the Legion at points around that time.
Yeah. I will say the normal international legion has never not been a disaster. Like there are foreigner elements here that are effective and do a lot of stuff, but the like core base international legion, the one that now will basically take anyone, that has always been a mess and that never changes. It was created more as like a political statement than an actual attempt to form like an effective fighting force. And this is really reflected in the fact that Legion recruiting will go and take everyone that signs up that actually has like it's not even just special operations, but like anyone most people that apply to join the International Legion that have like multiple combat tours as infantry and are highly experienced military professionals never get sent to the regular Legion. They all get sent off to several different sort of direct action teams that are considered to be special operations. And the people that end up going to the Legion, or the normal Legion, are people that did not serve in the military and do not have a lot of relevant experience. People that served in the military but not in combat arms. Maybe some people in combat arms, but no combat deployments. So it's they don't do much. When they do things, they have a horrible casualty rate. I know of some really solid guys that ended up there just because they kind of showed up and they're like, "I'm here to join the Legion," and but they all leave pretty quickly. And the other issue is that they don't pick officers for the International Legion based on like people that have cross trained with NATO, people that can speak English really well. The International Legion, from what I've observed, is basically a dumping ground for officers that like have dead careers or that no one wants to deal with, but they can't actually fire them. So they just put them over there, and that's the deal with that. So yeah, there are good units here that have foreigners. There are foreigners here that like there are foreigner containing units that do a lot, that are very, very competent, that are well equipped and do things the right way. But the actual International Legion proper, the big one that anyone can join, is a train wreck.
Yeah. And like you said, there are other units out there, Western units, and as I'm not sure if you've heard this term, but we were calling a lot of people fictional characters who sort of went to Ukraine for their own Call of Duty fantasies and never left Kiev or never left the bloody strip club or bar in Kiev, but walked around in multicams and and took photos in the bushes, and that was a bit of everywhere. There's a lot of these just pretenders getting around as well who do a lot of harm to reputation, to everything.
Yeah, no, I have a special dislike for a lot of those people because I when I came here, I was always very open about the fact that I never served in the military before I came here. I'm like, look, I'm trained as an EMT. I have a bunch of like firearms training experience, and I already had some training on small unit tactics and like CQB before I came here. I'm like, that's my experience. Don't have military. I'm very open and honest about this. And then there are all of these people that show up that just lie about being special operations.
Yeah.
And so for the first like 6 months or so that I was here, it was very hard for me to actually find a unit that I could get into because all of them were basically saying like, why should I take you when we have this guy over here that's a SEAL? And he's not a SEAL. Like none of these people are. I'm pretty sure that at one point there were more NATO special operations guys in Ukraine than there are in actually NATO.
Yeah, dude. I've never. It's a little bit like Vietnam. That everyone who served in Vietnam was a SEAL, SAS, or Delta, and it's like, well, there weren't that many guys doing that back then. And I've met more guys who claim that they are SAS in Ukraine than I have in my whole military career as well. You're like, hang on. Look, you actually came across my radar. Firstly, when I saw a post, you mentioned you're an EMT about Forward Observation Group.
Yeah.
Online play around some medical management there. Do you mind speaking to me about that? Because that intrigued me, and then I was like, who's this bloke? Because a couple of my mates shared your thing.
Yeah, so essentially, I was certified as an EMT when I lived in the United States. I did not actually work much in EMS because the pay is so bad that where I lived in Portland, and basically when I finished EMT school, they were paying $12.50 an hour for a 911 basics, and that paid worse than my like really shitty unarmed security job that I had when I was in school. So I just kept my certification active and kept on attending training and stuff like that because it helped me get better security jobs, but I didn't really work in medicine much. Then when I came to Ukraine, I actually didn't plan on being a combat medic. I was like, oh, like I can help out a little bit, but I was like, my level of training is wholly inadequate for that. But after I got here, I ended up working with a Norwegian combat medic a lot, and he kept telling me like, "Dude, you can do this. Just like I'll teach you. Let's go." And so he trained me a lot. I got to attend a combat medic course that near the start when I first got here that was run by a nurse that had served in the U.S. military. I did a bunch more training courses where I actually assisted like as an assistant instructor with some stuff that was also really good training for me. And then earlier this year, I actually finally went and got my proper Tier 3 T-Tri-C certification. So I actually now have all of the proper combat medic certifications to like American standards.
Good on you, bro.
But yeah, my issue with Forward Observations Group is that well, first of all, they're kind of on my shit list because they've posted pictures that they really shouldn't. I'm not going to say which one, but like 6 months ago, they posted a picture that they said from like near Bakhmut of some guys in gear and stuff like that with guns. And the problem is that picture was of the staging area my last unit used before we ran ops into Bakhmut. And it was like very clear, easily, like, immediately. I saw it, I recognized it immediately. And when they posted the picture, I'm pretty sure it was still being used. And I actually messaged them. I was like, "Hey guys, what are you doing? Take this shit down." And they just never responded to me. So it's Forward Operations Group is at basically the top of the list of clout chasing soft wannabe dickheads. It's Yeah, and as for the medical stuff, it's like there's some stuff when I watch their video where the guy breaks down his aid bag, like it starts off pretty strong. There's some good stuff there, but then it just veers off in this really weird direction where they want to like talk, where they're talking about being really high speed, essentially. They're trying to be different just for the sake of being different and cool. And it just, at least personally, left a bad taste in my mouth because over and over, because I got into it with the Ford Operations Group guy in the comments of my meme actually. And he's basically arguing, oh, since we have like our evacuation and we push our resources so far forward, we don't need to basically do what everyone else does. And by that, I mean have certain basic things and basic capabilities with you. Like they have almost nothing for treating. My issue is the guy basically hollowed out his main aid bag to store a couple of units of whole blood at the cost of not having like anything for managing hypothermia, and just generally heavily depleting most of the supplies he might carry if he had more than one patient. And I understand like whole blood is really cool, but the issue is you when you have a trauma patient that's really badly fucked up, yeah, you want to get him blood. The issue is you don't have to get him blood immediately. It's not like you need to be giving him blood as your first thing. Your highest priorities are to control the bleeding and go through the rest of your March algorithm and actually like keep them warm. And my whole thing is, well, great. If you're never more than 15 minutes away from your evac, why aren't you just saying, okay, we're going to give him blood on evac? Now I can carry twice as many medical supplies. So if more than one guy gets injured, I'm not screwed. So yeah, and then there's some other weird shit there too. Like one thing the guy said he does is he uses a drug called a TXA instead of a flush when preparing to give whole blood, and that he says he pushes it very quickly. The current guidance for TXA says it's a slow IV push medication because pushing it too fast can, in some cases, cause a sudden drop in blood pressure, which you really don't want in a trauma patient. Or it also has a rare side effect, especially when pushed too fast, of actually causing seizures. And so he recommends pushing it fast. He's like, I don't know why if you're supposed to do that, and I don't know what could go wrong, but like, I don't know everything. It's like, dude, you do not know like the basic information necessary to properly administer this medication. Like, it's right there. It's if you have gone through the, I did the latest tier 3 T-Tri-C learning material like 3 months ago. On the narc section, it's right there with TXA. Drip over 10 minutes or slow IV push. You not push it fast. And I know that like some of the guidance might be changing on that, and they're starting to think that the downsides to pushing it fast are not as bad as initially thought. But I just have a problem with someone giving information that contradicts what the official guidance and care standard is, and then also not knowing why that advice is different from the standard. That just really rubs me the wrong way. It's unprofessional and just makes me wonder, like, what other med-related mistakes is this guy making?
Yeah, and it's a dangerous thing when you're giving advice that isn't along guidelines. Like, I'm not even sure where the legalities sit on that around medicine. I know that's probably a bit of a blurry line there if it's against like the guideline of specific elements or drugs. A good friend of mine, you may know, Dr. Dan Pronk. He was a doctor in the SAS for an amount of years.
Is he he's a cardiothoracic surgeon, right?
No, he's another guy.
Oh, okay.
No, I know. Oh, who's that guy? I'm thinking.
You know what was, is it Greg? Fuck.
Yeah. Oh shit, I will think of it.
You could,
somewhere on my
you know who I'm talking about, right? He's like cardiothoracic, and there was, what was it? Cardiothoracic and something else. I ran into him at at one of the hospitals in Constantinople on my last deployment.
Yeah. Badasses. Like, you're like, how can you, I fucking hate people like that because I'm super low performance. I'm like, how are you also this level of an operator and this level of a doctor? I'm like, fuck off, give me one of the two. But
he's like 50 years old in amazing shape, but like never sleeps. And he's like,
yeah,
how are you? He's like, oh yeah, no, I got to go home and like see my my kids just moved out. I've got to go home and like move to a smaller house now. It's like,
yeah.
All right.
Well, I know with Dan, I've talked a little bit about wanting to do some like medical breakdowns with him about like trauma medicine, and he's like, the hard thing is if it's much beyond some of the real basics, you start getting into sort of gray zone around what's what. And he's like, and I'm a full doctor. He's like, I'm a doctor who's been working trauma med for a number of years, and there's so much gray zone in this of what you can and can't do. And it's so situationally dependent on blood pressures and as you know, with the use of morphine or ketamine or fentanyl around blood pressures and how everything goes, and the doctrine changes on this so quickly.
Yeah.
It's one of the it's a difficult thing, but I'm glad you touched on it. And I think there are a lot of people out there who are held to a high standard who need to, at least if they're at that, they need to maintain that standard or at least live up to where they are.
Yeah. No, and the other thing that pops up a lot with military medicine is that the scope of practice for military medics is absolutely obscene relative to the actual level of training. Like, as a combat medic, just not a paramedic, but just trained to the CMC standard for T-TRIC, I can do things like a surgical cricothyrotomy, or even like part of the course, I was also trained on doing finger thoracostomy, which is for like a tension pneumothorax, where instead of just using a chest, when like the chest burping the chest seal isn't enough anymore, or like needle decompression doesn't work, it's where you basically make an incision between two ribs and stick your finger in it to open it up and let some air out. And I was trained on that. I was trained on placing a chest tube. And this is something that in like normal civilian life, a lot of paramedics are not allowed to do.
Yes. Oh, it's a wide scope. So I was a combat first aider in my time in the military. And I remember talking to some friends who worked in medical field. I was like, oh, I can do on deployment. I can do this. They're like, what? Like, and you've done like a 3-week course. I'm like, yeah, oh, it'll be.
No, that's exactly it. Like at the CLS level, they teach guys chest needle decompression, and once again, that's a paramedic skill in the civilian world. Like,
I've got a needle T in the bag behind me, like, and I'm like, I'll carry that shit. I'm like, I'll figure it out on the fly again if I need to. I haven't done it one for a while, but we'll figure it out.
Just remember your landmarks. The problem with that one isn't that it's hard; it's that if you fuck it up, you're gonna kill the guy.
I know that's the problem. And the thing is, I work solo, so it's going to be on myself. What's good? That's the part of the game, isn't it? No. Look, to sort of go back onto you, when did you first, I guess, have interaction in, I guess, contact with the Russian forces?
So I did not manage to get a combat deployment until January of 2023. It was not for lack of trying. It was just go to a unit, wait for a long time, things go to shit, or we just aren't deploying, nothing's happening. Like after eventually in late May of 2022, I ended up joining the Normal International Legion. And from the first day I got to my unit, I was in 1st Battalion Alpha Company. We were 10 days out from deploying. I left near the end of July when we were still 10 days out from deploying. And stuff like that happened one more time where I went to a territorial defense force unit and spent like 3.5-4 months waiting for basically deployment orders or anything. Just ended up helping train a bunch of combat medics, and then after basically getting dicked around in my contract for a while and everything kind of going to shit again, I just went with a couple of other guys to a unit under 93rd Mechanized that was already forward deployed. And we didn't have to wait for contracts either. We just went directly to the FOB, signed contracts right there, and got rifles like the day after we arrived.
The Wild West, brother.
Yeah.
And how did that then go from there?
It went pretty well. We ended up having issues with the rest of our group not really being a good fit for the unit because it was mostly like medics at that point, and they didn't have a good way to integrate us. So we were there for about a month and did our time in the on the front line, and then that's when I went to my second unit where I spent the rest of my service for like around 6 months.
Yeah, right. And as a combat medic, what were the most like prevalent injuries or what you're dealing with the most?
Blast injuries. It's so many blast related injuries. Almost every single person I treated either had some like shrapnel in them or a TBI. It was overwhelmingly blast injuries.
And how was, a blast injury like that? You use a shitload of stores, from everything from burns and bleeds, bloody everything, even down to, I'm guessing, even spinal. How
Yeah.
the maintenance of actually keeping stores up in, I guess, mass casualty scenarios fairly common, often.
Yeah, well, I was both lucky and unlucky. So I was unlucky in the sense of I never had or almost never had less than 2 to 3 patients at one time. So whenever I never went physically like into combat on my second rotation. I was mostly doing like a medevac, but every single time I got called out, I would have multiple patients. It would always be anywhere from like 2 to 8 guys. Um, the good part is that most of these injuries were minor. Almost everyone I ended up treating would fall under walking wounded. Um, it was just lots of like little, really tiny pieces of shrapnel that a lot of times like the guys wouldn't even know was in them until I checked. It was like, oh, you got something here, and then lots of TBIs. So I was doing lots of TBI assessments, and that was the most of it. I did have one incident where there was a missile strike very close to where I was, and I had a guy with a more severe TBI and a broken nose that was bleeding everywhere. Um, that was kind of a messy one, but other than that, like I got super lucky. Nothing really bad happened where I was directly responsible for managing it.
Yeah.
Other people like on on the medical team I was on were not as lucky. There was my team leader actually had a 36 person mass cal physically inside Bakhmut. Um,
Fuck.
but yeah.
And can you give the viewers an idea of how much equipment that a combat medic would actually carry? Like how for a prior one CAS, how much would you actually carry? Just to put that number, I guess, in perspective. I know it's the variance on what they've got is great, but how
Yeah.
many could you
Well,
realistically treat?
let me put it this way, right? So normally I carry about 5 tourniquets with me in various forms, right? Now normally for certain like basic supplies, you also can rely on like the IFACs of the people you're treating. But you can go through, let's say you're really unlucky, one person can end up with 5 tourniquets on them.
Yeah.
I normally carry like generally like 4 chest seals total. So that's 2 patients right there. I did carry that being said, 4 chest seals is actually 8 chest seals because you can use the packages with tape to make more chest seals. Um, but the place where I'm generally most limited is medications. Um, for example, I carried like a 2 to 4 grams of TXA. That's 1 to 2 patients, maybe 4 patients if you only give each one a gram and rely on the casualty collection point or roll one to give them more. I had like some drugs are also just really rare here. For example, I only had 1 vial of midazolam, so or 1 ampule of midazolam, which is 10 milligrams, which should be enough for 2 patients. But the reality is, you don't use it that often. So if I have to give it to someone for a seizure or something like that, that's it. I'm gonna have to chuck the rest. Uh, that's and there's just also a limited amount of space for narcs. So with like a with both of my aid bags because I carry two normally, a smaller one that's my first line that's basically a really big fanny pack that I can easily swing around and work out of without taking it off, and then my primary aid bag which is substantially larger and has an eye gel and some other large stuff in it. I would say that I can handle 2 badly injured patients,
Yeah.
and after that I'm going to have to start making difficult choices about who gets what.
Yeah.
One thing I will say that the current TTRIC curriculum and standards struggle with is prolonged field care because In NATO, you assume rapid evacuation from the battlefield in general. Your evac times are measured in minutes, not hours, and certainly not days. Um, the shortest evac time I ever had when I was deployed was 4 hours.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was on my first deployment. And essentially, like, if you get hit, they'll send a KMAZ. The KMAZ will probably get to you in like 2 to 3 hours. Then it's another hour to 2 hour drive to the stabilization point. And also, it's not proper medical evacuation. It was literally just an open KMAZ truck in January in Donetsk Oblast, where it is extremely cold. And when it came to the actual position too, we didn't really have anywhere where we could stabilize a casualty. The holes were small enough that it was hard to lay someone all the way out, and certainly not realistic to have space to work much next to them. It was very cold. There were limited supplies for keeping people warm. You can't sort of fire out there unless you want to get immediately blown up. And so the reality was that if anyone got severely injured there, their chances were not good. And there were actually instances where people got injured and then they were more injured during evacuation than they were when they initially got blown up, just because of the truck bouncing over the road and basically throwing them around in the back and breaking bones.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something we heard about a lot from Bakhmut, was that the medevac Kazovac just was just not to the standard that people would expect. And I think a lot of guys coming across from Western militaries, where we're in Afghanistan, you have the golden hour that you can be basically anywhere on the battlefield to on a table in a role 2 facility. A role 2 is more like just not to you, but to someone there. Like a role 1 is more like a field medical facility. Role 2, and then you 2 alpha right over through. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. Is more than like a hospital with surgical capability.
Yeah.
It's
No,
been
the
a while
role two
since
can
I've done
offer
it.
like proper damage control, resuscitation, and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So
But we could be in a role 2, or I think a role 2 echo even, which is like full surgical capability within an hour. Where guys roll out to this and they're like, oh no, like you've said, it's hours. And then one of the big things you learn, at least on my advanced medical trauma course, what you speak of about you have enough for a couple of guys, but if you've got 30 casualties, then you're going through the process we call sort and sieve of who can I actually save. And burns take so much stores, bleeding takes a lot of stores, and it's like
yeah.
who's actually savable in this. And they're stories which were theories at one point run down of you could have a situation like this, and you see guys like yourself and your mates really doing it.
Yeah, I mean, for Bakhmut near the end, evac wait times could be as long as 16 hours because you were not running evac during daylight hours. You could only run evacuation vehicles in at night. So if someone got injured like in the morning, he's going to be sitting there until like 11 p.m.
Wow. And is there any like stories of losing someone or something that really stick with you?
Um, Not for me personally. I've heard some stories of people likely dying unnecessarily, but that had to do more with the training limitations of the medics that cared for them rather than available resources necessarily. Although I will say that a lot of people have lost limbs due to the lack of information on tourniquet conversion, as well as the overuse in some instances of tourniquets and the very long evac times. I I've seen a lot of pictures of people with like clearly destroyed legs because they've had tourniquets on almost like up at the hips. Oh, that's sorry, you just froze there for a second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah. I'm sorry. You said tourniquets up to the hips. That's where it froze.
Yeah, so like so they'd have tourniquets all the way up at the hips, and they just basically have to have everything below the tourniquet amputated. And I think one thing that the next iteration of the TTRIC guidelines really needs to include is a larger emphasis on early and aggressive tourniquet conversion.
Right.
Because the assumption that you can just slap that thing on, leave it there, and not worry about it too much because the guy's going to have it off in an hour anyways, and he's going to be good for 4. That might not apply in a future peer or near peer conflict. For what it's worth, the TCRIC guidelines do currently teach combat medics that you should attempt to convert the tourniquet or relocate it lower on the limb as soon as the situation allows, if possible. But I think that's just an element that really needs to be beaten on more, and potentially tourniquet conversion as a skill is something that should be included in a lower level of training like combat lifesaver. I mean, I know it's dicey, but a lot of people have been losing limbs that really don't need to.
Yeah. I think too, this assumption, at least in the West, into the West, like the NATO stuff that I've done, there's almost this assumption of air superiority. Like, and I've talked about this in a lot of combat scenarios too, that we assume that we will have air dominance superiority in the sky. What means choppers are coming in, vehicles can move in the daylight. You've got good counter battery, you've got suppression of elements, and like you've said, with like your prolonged casualty care, that just may not be the case. That there needs to be more emphasis on actually packaging these casualties, putting space blankets on them, keeping them warm, packaging them correctly in case there's something else hits. It's one of those things which I don't think is touched on enough. A lot of these scenario-based medical things you'll run is, you're in contact, they put a tourniquet on themselves, you drag them behind cover, you give them some fluids, you might put another tourniquet on, you may do some quick clot, whatever, drag them back into an area. Okay, sweet. Your simulated helicopter is rocked up. It's off to the dock. And you're like, oh, that's good. That's it. And it's this element of that just may not be the case in any conventional war that's relevant to training. There's no, that could, and for a whole amount of issues. But if we think that we're going to have the same superiority of the air we had in the last 20 years of war in the West compared to the next 20 years, we're kidding ourselves.
I mean, on one hand, I don't think we'll have as much air superiority, but on the other hand, if we've learned anything from Russia, it's that they're still basically at a 1980s tech level when it comes to their Air Force, so might be less of a problem than anticipated. I know China has much better aircraft than Russia, but well, yes and no. So they do actually have 5th generation fighter jets. The issue is that they're not necessarily particularly good, and all of their not 5th generation stuff is just like flanker clones, essentially. They just knock off the Su-27. So
they look good. The Su-27 is a sexy aircraft. I've always said what we
it is.
We need to get Lockheed and Boeing. We need the guys that the Russian design it, just who build the outside, and like this is how it's going to look, and then we'll do all the internals. It's a little bit like Lamborghini and Audi. It's like, okay, Lamborghini, the Italians, you design the outside, then we'll do everything inside, and then we'll have a good car now.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with the Su-27 though is that it has an absolutely fucking massive radar cross section.
Yeah,
it does not have the stealthiest shape, and America actually achieved doing everything the Su-27 does, but better with the F-22. It's just as, if not more, maneuverable, and it doesn't show up on radar. So, or at least not very much, and it also was too expensive. So that's why we got the F-35.
That's the healthcare problem. Did you or any of your mates actually treat any Russian soldiers, or you're walking around Bakhmut? Did you end up treating any Wagner PMC guys?
No, I did not. I'm pretty sure it's happened before, but that never happened. I think part of what it comes down to is at least all the places we were, the lines of contact were not, at least on my first rotation, the lines of contact were like 700 meters apart. And so no one was really getting across no man's land there. It was frozen. And then for Bakhmut and stuff like that, the situation's like so desperate and so chaotic that no one's taking like injured prison. There's no means for people to take prisoners or collect wounded or anything like that, because it's just not realistic. It's not happening. But I know it has happened, just not to anyone I know.
Yeah, right. And where do you see this conflict going? Because there's definitely been, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, the long-awaited counteroffensive that, sadly for a lot of people had, a bit of a rocky start and then a bit of a fizzled ending. how does it feel? You've got your finger on the pulse there. I'm not asking for some big tactical breakdown because we know that's
No,
generals doing that. But
I'm not an
how does
officer.
it, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's why you're a decent bloke, and I don't have to bloody call you sir. Nah, eating cucumber sandwiches. But how has the mood in Ukraine changed, or the mood amongst soldiers shifted now that we're seeing Russia sort of back on the offensive and making some ground?
Um, it's hard to say. I've been out of the military for a little bit now. I was planning on going back this last few months, but it just ended up not happening. The same deal, tried to join a unit, everything fizzled out, and just got another job essentially. But from at least the way I look at it, sort of Ukraine is at a crossroads right now, and that's dependent on basically the arrival of F-16s and on the other decisions by Europe and the United States on providing more military aid. Um, Ukraine needs air power. Like the reality is, if you have two dug in basically militaries that have fully entrenched themselves, unless one side has a substantial technological advantage to break up the stalemate, you're not going to have any meaningful movement of the lines one way or another until one side or the other faces such a high level of attrition that they are essentially no longer capable of manning those positions. Like, look at the Western Front in World War One. Did anyone ever break through the lines in that war and decisively push on anything really after it set in? No, the lines would move a few hundred meters this way, then a few hundred meters that way, and it stayed that way throughout the entire war until eventually just Germany couldn't really keep sustaining it and they went to the negotiating table. Like, it's so if Russia loses the ability to defend their airspace and Ukraine can begin running a large number of sorties to conduct airstrikes on Russian positions, that would meaningfully change the tide of the war. That would unstick the lines and get things moving. But if the status quo remains where air power is used sparingly by both sides and all of the fighting is basically being done by ground elements, we're going to be stuck here for a while.
Yeah. And what's your plan in the next coming months to return to fight, to keep training guys?
I'm willing to go and train people if I have a good opportunity. I'm open to potentially re-enlisting at some point in the next year, maybe like next spring or something like that. I already did one winter deployment. I really don't want to do another one. It's too cold. Um, but realistically, I suspect that my days of serving in the military are over. There's not a lot. I've been finding it pretty hard just to get back with a decent unit, and I mean, for me at least, I it's a struggle because I mean I have a fiance and she gets upset when I and I understand why she gets upset when I am away from home like that, and it's just I've been struggling to find a place to go to recently, and I just at this stage I'm very, very picky about what I do. I don't mind taking risks. The key is I have to know that I'm taking those risks for a reason. And my last deployment was emotionally very difficult because I repeatedly was ending up in situations where we were assuming large amounts of risk, but there was no tactically meaningful objective for these operations. And there's a limit to how much I can justify continuing to do that. And there's the other reality too that the Ukrainian army now is not the Ukrainian army that existed when the war started. And by that I mean that the Ukrainian military now is much more experienced than it was before. And so on a certain level, I feel like there's less of a need for me specifically to be there because now they have so many more people that have been trained to a Western standard.
It's a very interesting way to put it. That the training, I guess, from your perspective, has actually worked in that favor.
Oh yeah, I mean, and especially when you, what I'm getting at with this too is the language barrier makes it much harder for me to do my job because being a combat medic is fairly technical in terms of like you're giving narcotics, you're potentially doing advanced procedures, and part of being a good provider is doing a good job of handling, transferring your patients to a higher level of care. And it can be hard to do that properly when you lack the language skills to properly explain to the doctor what you have actually had to do to that patient.
Yeah.
Um, I know we have casualty cards and stuff like that that are like bilingual casualty cards sometimes, but oftentimes that's not enough. And it just, once again, if there was the same medic shortage that existed where there are not like medics trained to a NATO standard here, I would be like, well, I'll just do what I did before. But the reality is that Ukraine is actually standardized on T-Tri-C as their four protocols. Like now, Ukrainian medics are trained on giving ketamine, whole blood, doing surgical crikes, and they have this in their scope of practice if they've attended the proper training, which is increasingly widely available. So, like, I'm no one special, right? I'm not some sort of super high speed 18 Delta soft medic. So I can contribute a similar level of care to a lot of the newly trained Ukrainian medics, and I can't speak the language properly. So there's a limit to how much I can fit in at this stage, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Over your time in Ukraine, how much corruption or has the effect of corruption affected not only the units, but also then rolling through to effect on the front line?
It's really, really hard to say, honestly. Because some of the bullshit you'll experience here is as much attributable to occasionally just ineptitude as it is corruption. It's not like it's not like for example, the taking eternity to get paperwork done. Is that corruption or is it just because the people filing the paperwork don't care and nothing will happen to them if they don't do their jobs? Um, Honestly, in terms of equipment, I haven't seen an issue with like because I know one of the main canards I see on Instagram all the time is people claim that Ukraine is selling off all the weapons it gets and stuff like that. I'm very confident that is not true. And the reason for that is that when it came to getting, when for the most part it's come to getting weapons or ammunition, it has never been an issue, especially in any forward deployed unit. It's not, no one's running out of like NLAWs, AT4s, M72s. When I was with my last unit, I was issued like a CZ Bren 2. There was there wasn't really a problem with that. I would say one really good example where you will find corruption or at least nepotism, though, is cars, the way cars are handled. So, one massive issue with the Ukrainian military as a whole is the concept of slots. So, every unit is allotted a certain number of personnel, a certain number of weapons, a certain number of vehicles, and all that. And if they're at their maximum allotment for something like vehicles, the unit cannot actually formally accept donations of more vehicles because it's at capacity for vehicles. The issue is it will be at capacity for vehicles, but those vehicles will get issued out to people that don't need them. So, for example, guys that work in admin, like senior NCOs, people that like should not be issued vehicles will get these vehicles, and then teams that are actually running CASEVAC will struggle to get issued vehicles to the point where they'll have to like get donations and then maintain their own ones. And so it's I would say it's at least the form of corruption that I've seen most has been misallocation of certain resources based on essentially favoritism rather than like outright like theft and grift, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you can see that with equipment too. From my time in Ukraine and speaking to a lot of guys, that you'll have one unit with all this Gucci shit, like all the shit, and then a unit just down the road with nothing. And it's like,
It's like territorial defense guys in Lviv that all have PVS 31s at a checkpoint.
Yes, yeah, the best fitted soldiers or the best fitted guys in the whole of Ukraine are in Lviv. From weapons, nods, stuff I've seen, and it's like, Well, you're not actively up against the Russians fighting.
Yeah, no, all those guys, like, it wouldn't make a difference if they all had the worst, most beat to shit AKs available in the country. Like, you're not getting into gunfights, bro. Like,
And from your experience, how competent is the Russian ground forces that your boys have fought against in places like Bakhmut from Wagner or against the average Russian? I know there's a large scope. I know, in like say
yeah.
the Australian American Army, infantryman is an infantryman. Like, yeah, there's better and worse guys, but they're all at a standard, and the standard does this, where the Russians seem to have this along units. But how is the competence?
Well, that's like there's a huge fucking gulf. So I actually met a Scottish former, I think, SAS sniper or something like that, and he was legit. Like he ran out of patience here after like a month and a half or so, and then went and is now getting paid like $1,000 a day doing some contract in the Middle East or some shit from the last I heard. But anyways, the way he explained it after Bucha and Irpin is that like it's truly a crapshoot. Like at one end you have Mobics, reservists, and just like the conventional Russian infantry guys. And he said like the way he described it is those guys are basically like useless. You'll find them like by a fire with their rifle 10 meters away. And the way he described them was basically good for padding your numbers. And then on the other end, you have like the professional special operations guys, and those guys are very, very good. They will properly move, clear rooms, react to contact, set up complex ambushes, and are actually very, very dangerous. And he said that like during I believe it was Irpin, he ran into a team of those guys, and the way he described it, it was a real fight, and he's happy that he was able to get away from it.
Oh,
So it's purely a crapshoot. Like one thing the Russians do that's surprisingly effective that doesn't get much press is along the trench lines, they like to run these VSS teams at night. So the VSS is this sort of suppressed rifle intended for like urban sort of sniping. It's not long range because it shoots a subsonic round, but it's very, very quiet, and it shoots a very large bullet. And the way the Russians use it is they have three-man teams. They have two guys with VSS rifles and thermal scopes and a spotter, and then both snipers will fire on one target simultaneously from a surprisingly long range. And there's actually a lot of videos out there of them just killing guys that think they can go out and take a piss at 2 a.m. because it's dark out and successfully hitting them. And I actually had those guys try to shoot me. I it was 2 in the morning. I'd gotten out of the foxhole I was in to piss on a tree, and I just heard it thump thump. I was like, that's odd. So I went back down to the hole, went back to sleep. Next morning I get up, and one of the other guys with me said, "Oh, hey, I talked to the guy at the OP. There's a guy with a VSS shooting at you last night." I was like, "Great, why didn't you tell me?" "Oh, he called it out on the radio." "That's great. He's the only person here that has a radio."
wow.
But yeah, I'm pretty sure I was just saved by like a really nasty crosswind over the valley or something like that, because I've seen a lot of really concerning videos of those guys killing people.
Wow. Yeah, I've seen very similar. That shit can work. I think Grand Thumb has a really good video on the VSS. I think it's him. Breaks down that system and how it works.
Yeah.
How's your feeling as an American who spent a lot of time in Ukraine and fighting and treating? How is your feeling towards the average Russian soldier?
Um, Not very positive. Um, I mean, I know that like the conditions they fight in are horrendous and their command doesn't care about them, but there have been enough instances of people like shooting up recruiting offices in Russia or like lighting them on fire that it's like, if you know you're going to die going to Ukraine and you don't want to, you have options for doing something about it. Like, I don't buy the whole just following orders or I was mobilized or whatever. Like, no, they know, like, everyone has a choice. It might not be a fun choice, but ultimately, all of these people, when they're conscripted or mobilized, have a choice, which is comply or do not comply. The issue is both of those choices involve bad things happening. Like, yeah, if you go and blow up the recruiting office or stab your recruiter or whatever, you'll get shot or you'll go to prison, but it's not like your chances of survival in the Russian trenches are great either. So I for me, the way I look at it is that they're basically making a choice where they think they have a slightly higher chance of being alive if they go and do something really shitty. So they choose to do that. And that's the key. They choose to go and do something shitty. And so, yeah. And also, like, most of the war crimes being committed here are not being done by like special units or something like that. It's just endemic culturally within their military. If anything, the more professional units like the GRU guys or the FSB guys are the ones that don't do that shit nearly as much because they're more focused on actually they are actual professional soldiers. But I would not characterize most of Russia's military as professionals. Just it's a bunch of conscripts with limited moral compasses and I guess an axe to grind with anyone that's not as unhappy as they are.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about coming across those more highly trained, more deadly units. And I tell this to people in my side of the fence now, like journalism, that you'd much rather come across one of these more professional units than a bunch of just shitbag guys sitting on a checkpoint somewhere. That's the dangerous bit, is these young kids, young conscripts, whatever, with a rifle. Like, I'd much rather come across these better units somewhere than like these. And I always tell other people in my line of work, like, oh no, it's just a checkpoint with a couple of guys' guns. And I'm like, no, be careful of that. Like when I was in Israel last month, I'm like, no, this checkpoint with these random young kids on it who have just got put a weapon in their hands, that's what you need to be careful of. These Shiite 13 guys, these Golani Brigade guys, they're door kickers. Don't worry about them. They're not going to accidentally shoot you if you drive up in your car. You need to be careful of this other end of the spectrum, even if it seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Like all of the like the scariest experiences I had just previously traveling and stuff like that. It was like checkpoints are the ones that like, especially when you're in a vehicle, checkpoints are always the ones that are the sketchiest because people can just get super twitchy, and then once one guy start shooting, everyone else starts shooting, no matter what the reason is. And
yeah. Oh, the
yeah,
random
no,
checkpoints around Ukraine can be the same. You're like, oh shit, like who's this lad? And this, like, fuck.
yeah. For what it's worth, though, I will say that I've seen a. I don't watch a lot of war crime footage anymore. I did when I was still doing the journalism thing, but I decided that like once I transitioned more away from that, I was like, there's no reason to put myself through watching this.
Yeah.
But from what I have seen of the footage out there, none of like at least the really well publicized footage of Russian soldiers committing horrible war crimes has involved any of their soft guys, at least from what I've seen. If they probably are doing it, but at least they're not recording it. So
Yeah.
like it's always like the Mobit contingent or Wagner types, which are basically just mostly prisoners. So, I mean, oh, actually, that reminds me. Have you seen the stuff about how Wagner has rebranded?
Yes. I was reading that only yesterday, I think, on our Wallstar Atlas. They've rebranded into like the African Corps or something.
Africa Corps, which is the exact same name that the German Expeditionary Force to Africa used during World War II.
Well, Wagner was the Hitler's favorite producer or composer, wasn't he?
Yeah, no, I just think it's funny that Russia, part of Russia's propaganda is how they're allegedly fighting Nazis in Ukraine, but like they've rebranded Wagner as something even more overtly Nazi related, and they can't even pull the excuse of, well, we never noticed Dmitry Utkin's SS tattoos because Dmitry Utkin's been dead for like 4 months now.
Yeah.
So
Oh, it's crazy, man. It is it's a funny part of the world though, where we see in Russia, in Ukraine, in even other countries, Eastern Bloc, we do see a lot of like sympathetic Nazi shit. I remember that, of course you see it on some Ukrainian patches, is this and that. And then, but on the other side of the fence where Russia will go, oh, well, it's all this. And then you see a photo of inside like the VDV bloody gymnasium. And there was like Nazi symbology. And you're like, well, hang on. Like, it's but I think too, and I'm not being I think any of that symbology is disgusting. It's shocking. I've no time for it. But there is this almost law to it now of people like having it that is more symbolic than if they actually they don't agree with it, but the symbol is there. I probably don't have the best English for it, but you can find photos of a bloody Australian Bushmaster, like the same ones we've had in Ukraine, in Afghanistan, with a bloody swastika on it. Now I can tell you that those guys are not bloody Nazis, and I think that there's a lot of people with the symbols don't exactly align with the message now that we've moved that 80 years on. That said, I don't agree with the symbols ever being used, but yeah, I've had a few guys explain to me it's more about the symbology rather than the message of that. But you need to be very careful with the conflation.
Yeah. I think that there's a few elements to it. First of all, I think that some of it is a bit of a piss take, where basically people are saying, well, if you're accusing us of being Nazis, we might as well just go with the bit. Especially, I think the form of this that I always thought was the funniest was seeing the German Leopards and Leopard 2s painted with the Balkenkreuz.
Yeah.
Because that's you can see the joke there about German tanks fighting Russians on the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
But another element that I don't think gets discussed much is the Soviet Union made fighting Nazis like a key part of their national identity after World War II, right? But they never actually really talked about what the Nazis did that was so bad, because they basically did the same thing. So obviously they're not going to say like stripping people of their individual rights, persecuting people for their ethnicities, like mass killings and forced relocations of people are wrong, because the Soviet Union does all those things. So Nazi essentially became just a catch-all of anything for anything the Soviet Union opposed. And my understanding is that actually in the 1980s, Soviet punks started wearing Nazi-related symbols, not because they even necessarily had any understanding of what the Nazis really did, but so much for the reason that it was socially transgressive. That's being said, I'm not going to give people a pass in this day and age for that anymore, because like the internet exists. You can Google this shit. Like I'd say it's an explanation, but it's not an excuse, and it's not something I would endorse personally or ever want to be associated with.
No, absolutely. And what has been your experience with that in Ukraine? Because I know there's 0 to 100 of guys I speak to who are like, oh yeah, I served in this battalion and it was huge. And I've served guys who are like, man, I've never bloody seen it. What's your experience with that sort of symbology been?
I would say that for the most part, the furthest right wing European people that I've encountered, with maybe a couple of exceptions, they're generally more willing to use language that is considered unacceptable in the United States, but a lot of them also have less extreme beliefs than a lot of American conservatives.
Yeah.
Like it's really, really surreal. I've run into guys here with Nazi tattoos and stuff like that, that if you talk to them about politics, they have like more moderate political opinions in a lot of ways than like the average enthusiastic Trump voter, but they'll also like just use the N word constantly. It's this really weird dichotomy where there's like it's it's honest, it's really weird, because in some ways they'll use worse language, but then in other ways be less aggressively racist than some people from the English speaking world who will still not use that language. It's a really interesting phenomenon, and it just shows sort of how much I would say the Anglophone political world has diverged from the rest of the developed world in a lot of ways.
It's very interesting. Very interesting. But you got to remember, something like the N word, for example, in America holds a shitload of power because of the history of that word there. And we have similar words in Australia with the Indigenous Australians, where to Eastern Europe, the N word's like this thing they see in movies and rap. It wasn't that. Because there's words we may use that in other cultures, it's like, no, you can't use that. Like, and same with the Americans. If I say the C word, which I won't say on YouTube, but Americans, it's like, whoa, and I'm like, I'm Australian. It's like part of my ethnicity. But yeah, there's I do agree with you. For my months I've spent in Ukraine, that there's some of the language, some of the colorful language, like whoa, but yeah, it's a lot of colorful language, but I'm a white dude, so I can't say I haven't been discriminated against. But like I never have felt anything like that. It's a funny one. It is a funny
Yeah,
of this conservative, progressive, just different backgrounds, different people. And I
yeah.
think you have to remember too that I always call it the Soviet hangover, that Ukraine 30 years ago was part of the Soviet Union. And I think just as dangerous this glorification I see of Nazis and Germany is this glorification of the Soviet Union from people. And I see a lot of young guys in the West doing it. And I see a lot of, like, we see it bloody everywhere with Russian Soviet flags. And you're like, none of you obviously understand what this actually was. You listen to some of the songs and you hear about the glory of it. Read the Gulag Archipelago. Like, look into what actually happened here. The tens of millions that, or hundreds of millions that starved, the tens of millions that died of starvation and in the gulags. And like, this is not. Don't think it was better then. It even Putin has admitted it was not better then. Like, and if he's admitting that, trust me, it's not for anyone. But there's this graduation goggles that you look back on things as better than it was, and you're like, no, 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 that was fucking unbelievable.
Yeah, I think what a lot of these people do is they get halfway there. And what I mean by that is that they begin like reading material or history that's outside of what is normally taught in schools or outside what the media normally reports on. And they become more aware of some of the more unfortunate things the United States has done. And the fact that sometimes we as a culture are not entirely honest with ourselves about them. For example, a lot of things the CIA did during the Cold War in Latin America and stuff like that. And so they developed this worldview that basically boils down to America bad. And so then they also adopt the corollary of, well, if America's bad, that must mean that America's enemies are actually good. And so they go in basically saying, oh, well, America needs to stop doing all this. So I'm going to support Russia and China, which are left wing communist countries that do all this thing. But they just are falling in for the propaganda of places that are even worse. Like, does the United States government have the best foreign policy? No. If I lived in a third party neutral country, would I rather be invaded by Russia or China than the United States? Absolutely not. Like, the United States and NATO have rules of engagement. Like, yes, there is collateral damage. No, that is not acceptable. But the reality is, like, if an F-16 pilot makes a mistake and blows up someone's farm, the United States will normally like pay a substantial amount of money out to the people that lost their homes or livestock or whatever to actually make up for that. Like, if an American soldier is caught raping someone, that guy's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. In Russia, this behavior is encouraged. And it's the same deal where, like, China is not America, no, but if you ever actually go to China and spend a meaningful amount of time there, you'll quickly come to realize that society can get so much worse when it comes to surveillance, lack of civil rights. And also, a lot of these places are just as racist, if not more racist and oppressive than the United States. Like, the Soviet Union talked about equality and racism in the West and stuff like that. But at the same time, they repeatedly deported other non-Russian ethnicities from territory they took to Siberia and then replaced them with ethnic Russians, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Crimea. They do this over and over and over and over again. And functionally, the Soviet Union could claim to be multicultural and all that, but fundamentally, it was a Russian, Slavic, ethno-nationalist state. China does the exact same thing with the Han Chinese, where everything is focused around Beijing and the Han Chinese that live there and control everything, and every other ethnic group and all of their languages, cultures, and the like are actively suppressed. Like, it's not just an issue with Tibet or the Uyghurs, it's also like now they're starting to target Mongolians and stuff like that. It's like these places are horrible. And for all the problems the West has, there are not like active government programs trying to openly eradicate cultures in the name of creating this singular unified culture built around the one ethnic group that gets to participate in politics. So
No, you're 100%. You're 100% right. I always say to people that just think America, Australia, the UK people think these are the most racist countries on earth. I'm like, you need to travel a bit more. Go to basically anywhere in the world and you will see far worse, or read a bit of history. And I'm not saying that then for we don't make strides to make this better, but I'm saying, you know, we're a fucking lot better than the majority of the world. And you see this in these ultra left protests. You see them carrying hammer and sickle flags next to a rainbow flag. And you're like, well, you can do that here. Try go to St. Petersburg and do this. See how that goes for you. Don't tell me that this is, yeah, and it's just this watering down of what that history actually is. I think it's a very dangerous thing, and we need to come. And I like I spoke to you before this whole truth cannot damage a just cause. And I think this, you know, there's truths that are hard truths in Ukraine as well. And I believe Ukraine's fight is a just cause of defense, which everyone from you at a pub to a country, a state, has the right to self-defense. But that Ukraine has problems with a systemic corruption. It has problems with, you know, far right things. We need to like look at that in the eye and go, yep, that exists. And that also needs to be stamped out along with this other stuff as far as progression here, and not just, you know, swept under the rug.
Yeah. My main concern though, and about being honest about this sometimes, is that people, at least from what I've seen in the United States, will constantly seize on every single example of any form of malfeasance as proof that supporting Ukraine is a bad idea. Where whenever there's a discussion about military aid or something like that, they'll dredge up every single niche issue they potentially can and say, oh, this is why we shouldn't do it. And at least in the United States right now, it has hit this critical mass where they are very much struggling to pass another aid package. And there's currently an artillery shell shortage here. And so it's like, on one hand, I don't think the truth can damage a just cause. On the other hand, I think that there's going to be a time and place to talk about that. But focusing on that too much at this stage is actually damaging. And it's, I don't know. I feel really torn on this because on one hand, I do believe that you should have an open society and honest criticism of the government. But on the other hand, I really dislike the sometimes negative impact it can have when you are actively in a state of total war.
Yeah, that's difficult, isn't it? When you are actively at war, it's like, yeah, but we're trying to fight this whole other thing. What is the most dangerous, critical thing we've got right now? And it's the soldiers on our border. And yeah, and I agree with you. It's a very hard one, but of course it's going to be pushed. And you know, I believe personally, I believe this week, what is it, Tuesday evening here, so it's Tuesday morning in America. I think this week is the most important week in this whole war, other than the very first week of actually, you know, pushing back on that brunt of the Russian invasion. I think that this week, if a deal doesn't get done through Congress, Senate Friday, I think that could set a bit of a sort of ripple effect for the next 12 months. And I think this is the most crazy week in this whole thing, because of course they go on Christmas leave. Well, Congress actually went on leave last Friday, but they're back sitting this week to make this decision. And I think this is a incredibly critical week. And I haven't looked into it today, but at the moment, it doesn't look like something's going to get passed over the holiday break. I believe it will. I think at the last minute that something will, but yeah, and it's going to be used in political stands. You know, people are going to use all these, you know, these examples of corruption or a battlefield effect not being what we thought it was, and will use that to their advantage, their voter pool, and push on where they're trying to get themselves politically. And I think Ukraine is, I think this is a very, very important week for Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that something gets passed, dude, because when you start like artillery and stuff like that is really important, and the more the stuff gets delayed, like these delays actually kill people. Like people die when necessary equipment doesn't get where it needs to be. Will that equipment stop everyone from dying? No. Are more people going to die than they would otherwise without it? Absolutely. Like, it's concerning.
Yeah. Mate, is there anything you think we haven't touched on that you'd like to touch on? Any stories, any treatment, any dickheads on the media, anything?
Um, there's nothing particularly big that I can think of. I think that covers most of it. Yeah,
Awesome. And where's the best place? I'll put your link to your Instagram and stuff below, but is there anything you'd like
thank
to
you.
say to people coming across and saying hello?
Um, yeah. And that's for just other foreigners that might want to come and fight for Ukraine. Do your research ahead of time and have like an actual unit that you know will take you and has a reasonable recruiting pipeline before you get here. Because it's very easy to end up in paperwork limbo where you end up waiting 2 or 3 months just to get your contract done if you don't have that fully established in place ahead of time. If you have the right unit lined up, you can have your contract done in like 2 weeks or something like that and be training immediately afterwards, pretty much. If you don't do that prep work ahead of time and network properly, you're going to end up burning a lot of money just sitting around. And this is one that I learned the hard way repeatedly.
Yeah. Well, mate, look, it's been 95 minutes. Thank you very much, man. I really appreciate it. And for sitting and have a chat open and honest with me.
Thank you. It's a
Mate.
great time.
Oh, mate, no, pleasure is mine. If you ever need anything, reach out. And if you ever want to get back on and chat shit or chat war, please feel free. It's always open to you and your buddies.
Huh. I'd definitely be open to that.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, mate. You stay safe over there.
Yeah, thank you.
See ya.